So The Ambassadors of Death is a serial which feels like it exists rather than being anything special. It's the final serial to bear the name of David Whittaker, but its writing process is interesting, perhaps more interesting than the serial itself. There are definitely pros to this story to be discussed, but it's a serial which has its problems, with many outweighing the good. But let's get into this serial and find out why I think this. So the serial begins with a rescue mission underway, after a loss of contact from Mars Probe 7. This gives the serial an immediate hook, as things are already underway, with no need for any build-up. In fact, for the most part, this opening episode is quite strong, with the first half being very good. We got the operations from the command centre, alongside many comedic moments from the Doctor, who is busy with the TARDIS console, which has been removed from the TARDIS. So this is an interesting development, showing the console outside of the TARDIS. But perhaps more notably, this is the first time that the console has appeared in colour. It's mostly here for a bit of a gag scene, but will become important in the next serial. The scene in question has the Doctor accidentally send Liz a few seconds into the future, and then the same thing happening to him, which means that they keep missing each other for a bit. It's a funny scene, even if it's a bit out of place, given it's in the same scene as the Doctor referencing the Brigadier having blown up the Silurians. The one thing I do want to note about this scene is that the Doctor refers to the time vector generator as a part of the console. This is very interesting, as in Whittaker's previous serial, he had a device of the same name which was a piece of the TARDIS that kept the inner dimension connected to the outer dimension. So it seems that Whittaker is either accidentally recycling the name here, or remembered the name from the previous serial and just used it here, not remembering what it was for. I know this is nitpicking, but I just find it interesting that this occurred in the first place. With that scene over, the plot gets going here, as there is a signal blasted at Earth from Mars Probe 7, which the Doctor seems to recognise but can't remember where from, although this plot point goes nowhere, but does lead to him going to the command centre so he can find out what the signal is. This does give us some great moments of the Doctor lording it over people, using his presence to try and gain control of the situation, but ultimately he needs the Brigadier's assistance to get what he needs. But by the point where he can, the original signal is no longer being transmitted, and instead of responses, the rest of the episode focuses on them trying to find out where the new signal is coming from, before having a gunfight, which has a few odd moments in terms of its direction, but it's a solid enough episode. The big thing to note about the last few minutes of the episode is this. The ending sting, the iconic sound which begins the ending titles, has finally been introduced to the show after 6.5 seasons, which is somewhat shocking it took so long. It really gives a lot more impact to the cliffhangers compared to the more mundane fades out we often got in the previous seasons, although ultimately this serial uses a part of the opening titles as well. It's quite unique and does actually affect the recaps, as it allows for a complete scene change or big change up to the current scene, which can be hidden. It was an interesting experiment which is cool, although I am glad that it's unique to this serial, as I feel it's a bit weird to have the credits end and then suddenly come back. With episode 1 discussed, this is where the rewrites come in, and I'll talk about that process in detail later. But let's talk about the plot itself. So the plot is about the hunt for 3 astronauts who have been kidnapped by some group who turn out to have captured them due to them being alien ambassadors who have come to Earth to make peace with humanity. This reason for their kidnapping and the ambassadors coming in the first place is due to General Carrington, who was an astronaut on Mars Probe 6. During this mission, he met the aliens, and due to their naturally radioactive bodies, killed his friend by accident. This sort of made him go a bit mad, which led to him seemingly setting up peace talks so he could get some of the aliens to Earth, so he could reveal them to humanity and start a war between the two races. So this is a very interesting idea for a serial, a conspiracy story about someone trying to start an interplanetary war. The problem is that the serial is not good, so it's one of those serials which has an interesting idea but horrible execution, with it having one of the worst. The majority of the plot revolves around UNIT trying to find out who is responsible for kidnapping the astronauts. This takes basically the entirety of episodes 3 through 7, with a discovery of the crew having gone missing at the start of episode 3. Now yes, it isn't a case of UNIT hunting for the astronauts, but so much of the plot is a search which doesn't have much going for it. It does shift to the astronauts being used as mercenaries, but that doesn't change the UNIT plot of finding the astronauts. The biggest break from this is when the Doctor goes into space to find the truth and discovers the spaceship of the ambassadors where he learns the truth. But when he gets back to Earth, he's immediately kidnapped and is taken to a location where he could have just learned that information anyway. So much of this serial feels like padding to keep it going, with so many breaks into the command centre happening. Seriously though, how did this keep happening, especially after the attempt on the Doctor's life during the rocket launch? The fact that the same guy was able to sneak back in hours later is unbelievable. The pace is quite slow and it's somewhat draining to watch because of this. While there can be some great dialogue at times, notably when the Doctor arrives at the command centre, but for the most part the characters aren't the most interesting and it all comes together to be tedious at 7 episodes. The serial does try to spice things up with a plot line about the aliens being used as mercenaries, but this comes very late into the serial. While it's not adding much to the overall plot, it does get to give some characterisation to Regan and the ambassadors themselves when they talk at the end, but it feels a bit tacked on as a way to keep the plot going forward, given the main plot of the conspiracy feels like it could have come to its conclusion far sooner. Things ultimately wrap up with the Doctor communicating with the ambassadors and using them to get into the command centre to stop Carrington from revealing the existence of alien life to all of humanity. The final action scenes are quite strong. At this point, Carrington has arrested all of UNIT, which, given that they're a UN organisation, should have some serious ramifications, even if the soldiers themselves are pulled directly from the army. But this leaves the Brigadier with about 4 men to lead an assault to save the Doctor before they work together to stop Carrington. I say about 4 men as the number seems to change between the location filming and the studio sessions, but with things wrapped up we get another massive problem. That being that despite being at 7 parts, which feels like it's being stretched out, the episode doesn't have enough time for a proper conclusion. With the day saved but the threat of the Ambassador's people destroying the Earth still present, unless the Ambassadors are returned, the Doctor just walks off. He says that everyone else can do the talking to the aliens and can do the return, as he isn't necessary, before walking off, meaning that when the episode ends and the Doctor walks away, the planet is still in danger of immediate destruction. This is just perplexing. It feels unsatisfying and incomplete. There have been only a few endings in the show like this so far, but this has to be the worst as it feels so off. There's no breathing room after the conclusion, with the astronauts who were the starting point of the serial still up in space. If this had been a rushed conclusion after a shorter serial, then it would have made sense, but after 7 episodes which felt slow in pace, it's really insulting. On the characters, there are 3 notable characters in the guest cast, those being Cornish, the head of the command centre, General Carrington and Regan. Their prominence really helps them stand out, but all of them are at least somewhat interesting. I'll begin with Cornish, since he's the least interesting of them, with him sort of having to spend the entire serial secondary to someone else, due to first UNIT taking over and then later Carrington. This does mean they could have just been a one-note character, but I think he's decently well-rounded. He's dedicated to his work in search of the astronauts, with him starting off very much disliking the Doctor due to him storming in and trying to take command, but comes to support him later on as he proves his worth. Probably the best scene of this is when he's basically having to defend the Doctor from Carrington as being capable of travelling into space. But that basically sums up Cornish. He is important, but a lot of our importance is lessened as the serial goes on, and the plot moves away from the control centre. Next we have Regan, who is important later on in the plot, with him taking over as the face of Carrington's men, replacing the initial group he had for some reason. Yeah, I'll come back to that on Carrington, but Regan and his mob don't appear until the later episodes, once the Ambassadors are on Earth. Regan is quite interesting, as despite seeming to work for Carrington, he seems unaware of what his plans are, and has his own to gain wealth by using the Ambassadors. He is the one who leads the Ambassadors in their missions, and the one to break into the command centre like half a dozen times. Regan is quite a fun character, mostly because you want to see him lose in the end, as he treats everyone around him like rubbish, with him only thinking of his own gain. This does make him a somewhat interesting character, even if he lacks any sort of depth, but gives him the chance to have interesting dynamics, as this self-interest has to go up against struggles to keep the Ambassadors alive. One of the best scenes is where he tricks Tatalian into blowing himself up by giving him a bomb in the case, but change the timer to 0 while he's not looking, this being in the plan to both silence him and deal with the Doctor, which goes wrong because it's a useless bomb. Okay, so this is a tangent, but the bomb is meant to be powerful, and so Tatalian needs time to escape its blast radius, and is thought to be given 15 minutes to escape, but the bomb does so little damage that the Doctor standing a few feet away only gets a scratch. This is just such an odd scene due to the execution of it, but that basically wraps up things for Regan, as there isn't much to him at all, although he has a great presence throughout the serial. Finally, we have General Carrington, who is the most prominent of the guest cast. He exists in the position where he's able to override the Brigadier's authority, alongside having support from the Ministry, as he is apparently in charge of a secret defence organisation. This whole organisation feels like a throwaway idea to act as a cover for what he's been doing throughout, as it's only mentioned once or twice and will never appear in the show again. The most interesting side to Carrington is obviously the events we don't see. The events that happened on Mars during the previous mission which led to him taking this action. The idea of having someone shaken like this because of how badly a first encounter situation went is a very cool idea, but it feels like a background detail in the larger serial, as although it's his motivation for doing everything, with how long the serial is, it kind of gets lost in the mess of the plot. He is an interesting character though, but at the end of the day, the execution of this falls flat, and so that interesting side is lost. His final scene is probably his best, with him having been beaten and so he just sort of stops functioning. I think the acting really gives this scene some power. For as good as this is, it's a bit underdone, with his trauma not being presented throughout and only kind of being mentioned when necessary. It feels like something that could have been fleshed out much more. So now I want to talk about the people who work for Carrington as a collective unit. So the reason I find this group interesting is because of how the serial seems to change up what sort of people he has working for him as the serial goes on. In the first few episodes he uses soldiers who are loyal to him, something the Doctor notes when they're interrogating one they captured. But as the serial goes on, this switches to a bunch of criminals with Regan in charge of them. I don't see why this decision was made. It feels like an oversight, but it kind of hurts Carrington's character somewhat, as I think the idea of him having such sway and presence and respect that he's able to get soldiers to join him, but with it just being a bunch of criminals at the end, it takes away from this bit. Now the best reason would be that he switched to criminals once his plans clashed with the organisation he was in charge of, but some of their actions towards the beginning do make me question this, notably their multiple attacks on UNIT and then leaving enough of a paper trail for them to be followed back to the Ministry later. Now Carrington did order his men only to delay and not kill the first time over and use non-deadly weapons the second time, but in their first battle it doesn't seem that way at all, with several people killed on both sides. I think the idea of Carrington just using loyal men throughout would have been far more interesting. That's basically the notable members of the guest cast, so on to the main trio, who are quite varied here. The Brig is as good as ever, getting in a lot of action scenes, but due to Carrington forcing his hand on several occasions, he does feel limited in the later episodes. His best moments are probably in the last episode, when his men have been arrested and he escapes before leading a raid on first the facility holding the Doctor and then the command centre. There's generally a lot of action for the Brig, with him not having a captain under him this time to do some of the heavy lifting, although in a small role we do see the return of Benton, now a sergeant, who will become a mainstay of the show from this point on, so we'll talk about him in a later serial. Unfortunately, there is no follow-up between him and the Doctor over the Silurians, even though it is mentioned early on. Liz is probably at her worst here, with her spending a lot of the story as a prisoner, which really limits her. She doesn't really get to do anything in the later episodes, although she does get to have a quite fun dynamic with her fellow scientist and prisoner, Lennox. Lennox himself is somewhat interesting, but a bit too limited in the serial to be a big enough part of the guest cast to discuss on his own. Having Liz paired up with another scientist is fun to see, although she is in a position where she basically spends a decent chunk of the story just carrying around tubes of radiation. She makes an escape attempt during her imprisonment with the help of Lennox, but this fails due to random bad luck. There's not really a lot to say about Liz in this story, unfortunately. She's too limited, although does partake in a cool chase scene. The Doctor is once more at the forefront. This serial really shows him off in many different ways, with him getting to do a lot of scientific stuff alongside going to space. The lessening of Liz doesn't really hinder him either, with him being able to explain a lot of the technical stuff to other characters, which makes the disappearance not as important as it might have been otherwise. A lot of the serial though has the Doctor arguing with other people, due to them getting in the way and problems coming up, a lot of which is to do with the near constant security breaches. We do get to see his technical side on a few occasions, notably towards the end when he makes a device to contact the Brig, and then communicates with the aliens, but for the most part there isn't anything especially new or interesting added from the previous serials. We do get to see more of Bessie in action and find out a bit more about what the Doctor has done to her, notably adding a force field to prevent criminals from escaping or stealing it, which is interesting and does make for a fun scene. Although the one thing that the Doctor adds to this serial which is both interesting and completely stupid is this.
Oh, the tape. Oh, here it is.
So the Doctor has the ability of transmigration of matter, something he calls a conjuring trick, but it's something I just don't have words for as it's just such a weird thing to add to get out of a cliffhanger. But with that covered, let's talk about the writing process, as this serial went through a bit of a rough development. So it was originally written to be a serial featuring the second Doctor alongside Jamie and Zoe, with no unit and it being set in the far future. This meant that to fit the new format, the serial had to go through heavy rewrites, which Whittaker did not do himself, I believe due to his health at the time. This led to episode 1 being rewritten by assistant script editor Trevor Ray, and the rest being done by Malcolm Hulke. Episode 1 is the strongest, even though it has problems, but you can see the rush to get the script in shape in the rest of it. Despite these rewrites, this serial is only credited to Whittaker, this being due to contracts and all that, although interestingly the DVD case does credit Ray and Hulke. It is very unfortunate that this would be the final serial that Whittaker would have his name attached to, given the low quality of it, despite the good idea at its core. Now for the colorisation of this serial. So like with the previous serial, this one was colorised, but it was a far more complex process than the Silurians was. So episode 1 is in full colour from the original master tape, which is why it's in such good quality compared to the rest of it. This also makes it the earliest episode to survive in the form of an original master tape. Episode 5 used the same restoration method as the Silurians, but the remaining 5 episodes used a new method called chroma dot recovery. So this process is even more complex than the other method of combining signals, but it essentially breaks down into the colour existing in the black and white image through a visible crosshatch, which occurred when filming a colour screen with a black and white camera. I'd highly suggest looking into this process further if you're interested, as how this came to be and how it will affect later serials is at times mind-blowing. The final thing I want to mention is Havoc, that being the stunt team who made their debut with this story. I don't have anything really to say about the Havoc team, as they are a stunt team, which means they do the stunts of the serial. With this serial featuring a lot of action scenes, the battles at the beginning and end, alongside the chase in episode 3. The stunt team really showed off their skills in this serial, but it will be the next serial which really shows them off more. So the Ambassadors of Death was very lacklustre. It has one of the best ideas the show has shown us so far, but the serial's development and its length really hurts the idea, as it's forced to keep going and then wraps up suddenly. It is disappointing that this would be Whittaker's final serial for the show, even if the final product wasn't entirely his. Following up the Silurians also doesn't help it, given the high quality of that serial, but at the very least it does give us a unique idea that the show never really used again. But next time, units are called in to oversee a project to drill through the crust of the Earth, but the danger that awaits the Earth is terrifying, and the Doctor has disappeared to another world that is about to meet its end. Next time, Inferno.